A late start, but a great start.
Everybody want to be hip hop? Everybody want
Good evening, everybody. Everybody hearing? This is the time to get started, so if you can find your seats, get your food. All right, really happy to have people here. I'm almost swallowing the microphone, so if you don't quiet down, it's really going to go down my throat. So, anyway, good evening again. Oh, this is Detroit, right? Come on, good evening. Right, we got to sort of get ourselves grounded and centered into why we're here. I'm Peter Hammer. I apologize for missing the first class, but I teach at law school here at Wayne State and direct the Key Center. I'm very happy to collaborate with these wonderful people. And they're so efficient, they actually have the video on screen already. So I was actually watching the video today to be prepared. And I want to give you a sense of the intentionality of what we often call the arc of the program, right? So this notion of, two societies to a new society, and then we think about how we're going to go this journey together. So last week you had a deep introduction to the Kerner Commission report and the context where that was done. We're going to end up applying all of these theories to the city of Detroit, looking at contemporary issues. But one of the things we thought we had to do is get us to think about cities, right? Get us to think about societies, get us to think about how we organize ourselves. And so tonight is called Contesting Visions of the City, right? And to show you what we do behind the scenes, we had a very long discussion about whether it should be contested visions of the city or it should be contesting visions of the city, right? Both of them are important, that there's no one vision, right? You all bring different experiences and visions to it. We're often fighting as a matter of politics about what vision that we want to be supporting. But the important thing about going from contested to contesting is it's showing we're all involved, right? And this is an ongoing fight. And this is a struggle that we're having to have conversations about and educate ourselves about and really listen to three wonderful people from the community. They're going to be sharing their vision about what the city could or should be. Right, so that's a little bit behind the scenes, and that will get us then to where we're going into next week, which is thinking about the development that's happening in the city or not happening in the city, and who's benefiting from it. Right, so we're going to go from a historical context into setting up next week and following weeks. We'll be looking at development in the city, and whose model is that? What is their vision? Who benefits from that vision? And we're going to set up those set of questions from tonight. But I'm going to turn it back to my friend Stephen.
Thank you, Peter. You hear me okay? Yes. So today we can think about several questions, such as who is the city for? And how has that been understood and answered in the past? How is it understood and answered today? And perhaps most importantly, on the foundation of those, how is that answered and will be answered in the future? And I'd like to bring Eliza here now to the mic to introduce our first of our three speakers to guide us in those questions. Give it up for Eliza, please.
It's so funny because we have this welcoming couch, right? And then nobody wants to sit on it. We thought we were trying to be welcoming. So Buju, Ani, Nilse, everyone, again, yawa na to kasi wachito priya adequatoli, masquage que fue indigenous. Adequatoli indigenous. My name is Eliza Quals Perez. My name is Eliza Quals Perez. And I just introduced myself to you. I may not have explained this fully last time. Very briefly in Nahuatl, which is the major ancestral language of my mother's people from Mexico, and also. We can't hear you.
You can't hear you.
How is that possible? Yeah. So I need some help on the mic.
It doesn't go up any louder. You have to speak loudly into the mic. Loudly into the mic.
So it's a major. Nahuatl is a major language from Mexico, indigenous language, and that's where my mother is from. And I know a tiny little bit of it, mostly through song. It's one of the ways that I do my cultural work is through song. And I also introduced myself to you in Ojibwe, which is one of the major languages of people whose territory we're in. And they are also still here with us, so they're not extinct. And that's one of the things that we want to make sure that people understand about Detroit. And it's one of the reasons why we are continually trying to bring our Indigenous family members to be part of this series. So you'll hear in just a moment from Rick Schott, who's Mohawk and Purepecha. And I want to say a few words just about DEAL. Detroit Equity Action Lab, we're a co-sponsor of the group, and I just wanted to ask, does anybody do you know what DEAL is? Is there anybody in here that knows what the Detroit Equity Action Lab is? I just want to get a sense. So we are doing our job because this is our 3rd year. So thank you to Aisha Jamali, our communications specialist, who asked me to do that because she thought we might have some work to do. We're a project that is housed at the Damon J. Key Center for Civil Rights at Wayne State Law School, and our understanding is that Detroit has this huge problem with colonialization and structuralized racism, systemic racism. And so we try to address that problem by exposing those forces and the ways that they segregate us and hurt all of us, and build relationships together through a fellowship process, also through events like this, so that we can build our knowledge, expose what's happening, and then build new ways, better ways to create opportunity for everyone. One of the major things that we talk about in DEAL, we have an understanding of racism acting on, structural racism acting on 3 levels. So that's policy, which is also like laws, practices, behaviors, so, and then cultural messages that we get through society, and those messages have belief systems embedded in them. And I think one of the reasons why we haven't made as much advancement in anti-racism work is that a lot of times we're just pushing on the policies and practices part and not doing the belief systems part. So I'm gonna try to tell you a story that somewhat illustrates this, and it's also a call to action. Last week we were introduced to this space by Baba Daryl, you remember that? And we also wanted Sawatu Salam Ra, the co-director that co-leads EMEAC and the Cast Commons. We wanted her to also welcome you to this space last Thursday. Last Thursday, Sawatu was convicted of 2 felonies, felonious assault and felony firearm, for defending herself from someone else who rammed her car while her 2-year-old baby was inside of it, and cussed her out, and then revved her car at her, threatening to run her and her mother, Rhonda Anderson, Mama Ra, and her 2-year-old baby over. And Sawatu knows what her rights are, and that she has the right to defend herself, and she had a CCW. She brandished her weapon in an attempt to let that person know to stop. She didn't shoot it, no one was injured, and that person took pictures of the fact that she had a gun in her hand, and then went right to the police, and her story was believed over Sawatu's. And I think that, and that person changed their story, because after Sawatu gave the report to the police, and they saw the damage to the car, they put that in the report, and then that complaining witness saw that they had put the damage to the car, so then she made up a story about, oh, well, I hit the car because she pointed a gun at me and it was scared. And so she changed it, and it was on the record that she had changed it. And then on the stand, she changed it repeatedly. And they showed her the transcripts. Her attorneys showed the transcripts that the story was changing. But she was still believed over Sawatu. And what I understand is that in the very beginning of creating blackness and whiteness in this country, one of the things that made a difference in that is that white people had the right to self-defense and black people did not have the right to self-defense. That was a law. So the ways that black women would get raped by white men, it was a crime for them to fight back and defend themselves. It was a crime for them to fight back and defend themselves. So That's a policy that has now changed. Theoretically, that policy is not on the books anymore, but something happens, and I can't explain it. I don't know what it is, but there's a belief system that comes out of that is embedded in the practices of how things actually play out.
That's right. That's right. Exactly.
And that belief system gets passed down, even though people don't even know. Most people in this room probably didn't know that it was actually a crime for a black woman to defend herself against rape. But that's actually what's still happening in the court system. That practice is still being passed down. The same with the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment, I just heard Noam Chomsky speak about this on Sunday, eloquently, the same as Roxanne Ortiz Dunbar. She just put out, she's an indigenous author, she just put out a book about the origins of the Second Amendment called Loaded. And both of them speak to the origins of the Second Amendment. You know, the right to bear arms it was designed for white men to be able to control slaves, enslaved people, largely black slaves, and kill Indians, and continue their westward expansion. And there's quote after quote after quote about that's what it's about. And we see that play out. So a white man can stand his ground, but a black woman cannot.
That's right.
And it's very similar to, I don't know if Rick Schott will speak to intergenerational trauma, but I really think of that as an akin thing. Our communities go through intergenerational trauma, so this has been proven scientifically in studies that indigenous people, when they go through the trauma that they've been through genocide, displacement, fostering out, all of those policies, the Jewish people that went through the Holocaust, our genes literally change. Our genes literally change because of that trauma. And we have a similar parallel system that happens when we have these policies that change, but somehow the belief system does not change. The practices stay the same. And so I wasn't planning to talk to you about that today, but because of what is happening with Sawatu, because she is the leader of the space that we're in, and her mother is also a member of DEAL, so she's part of, she leads a DEAL organization. EMAC is a DEAL organization. Mama Ra is with the Sierra Club National. They are long time upright activists fighting for the rights of people to breathe air that doesn't make them sick, and to have clean water that doesn't make them sick. They're amazing women. They're amazing warriors. It kills me that they had to feel that way, but then to not even have the right to defend themselves and protect themselves. So we know them personally. I see the things that we teach play out, and I couldn't not bring that here and let you know that that's what's happening. And her defense team and her freedom team is asking for things of us. So there's a webpage up there, so if you want to get more involved, they're asking for letters of support to the judge. There's another thing that I didn't tell you. She's 6 months pregnant. She's 6 months pregnant. Her lawyers are, I don't know the actual range that she's facing, but I was told, it was almost like they were saying, we hope it's only 2 years in prison. And there was a case in the last year on the east side of Detroit that, not Detroit, but the suburbs, the metro region, where a poor white woman was pulled over for having like a cross or something on her rear view mirror. You know that sort of traffic violation where they just pull you over for nothing? So she got pulled over for that. She didn't have the money to pay the $100 ticket or whatever it was, so they put her in jail, and she was rotting in jail over this, having had an adornment hanging from her mirror, and she was pregnant, and she went into labor in jail, and they wouldn't transport her to the hospital because they didn't believe her. And I believe she asked to be transferred twice, and they didn't believe her till she was actually crowning, and at that point, it was too late to transport her. So she had the baby on the cell floor of the jail. So if that happens to white women in the suburbs, what will happen to Sawatu? So that has me fired up for her freedom and for the freedom of all my black brothers and sisters. They're asking for letters of support. They're asking for us to go to the courtroom on March 1st and show up for her. I believe Mama Lila made the challenge last time of just sort of like, we need white people to support us in our struggles for these same reasons. And I hate that it's like that. I would like to live in a society where a white or a black woman could just be believed, first of all, and not get charged. And a black woman could be represented by black attorneys. And the black attorneys would be believed. And the judge wouldn't be challenging the law that they said is the law and that they have to prove it because that's what happened. We don't live in that world yet. So we need some white folks to show up and show some support. So I'm begging you to do that. I'm actually holding tobacco in my hand right now, and this is an indigenous practice of asking for something. My prayers are in this for her, and if you're willing to accept that and to just at least pray for what you can do. There's also a fundraising campaign to help with her legal defense. Her attorneys, my understanding, are operating pro bono, but it's very expensive, and now they're going to have to do an appeals process, and it's all uphill. So, and then there's a lot of community support that's going into this. So you can see me afterwards if you're willing to accept that and at least pray to make a commitment. What can I do for Sawatu? I'm asking you to do that. And we can send out the link to the webpage so that you have more information. So with that is what Black and Brown communities have been dealing with since October 12, 1492 on this landmass. We've been dealing with this largely together because when the Spanish invaded, when the Spanish invaded,
Just talk loud.
Turn off, even to turn on again.
the Dominican Republican Haiti and then Puerto Rico. Very quickly they went to Africa and kidnapped people from Africa and brought them over as slaves, as enslaved people. And so indigenous people and African people have been going through this for 525 years and 4 months together, essentially. And we've got to change these beliefs. We've got to change these cultural messages. We've got to change the belief systems. The way we do that through Deal is being more careful about the words we use, creating our own media, having a journalist on our team, having a communications specialist on our team. So we're trying to build new belief systems. We do it through cultural work. So Deal is now hosting an open mic here on Thursday nights, every second Thursday, with Will Copeland, who's also part of EMEAC. He's hosting those. So those are some of the ways that we're trying to change the cultural messages and like also share new, beautiful images of who we are. Rick Schott has been doing that kind of work for a really long time. He and I have been close friends and cultural theorists. And actually, so this is a reunion for us since the late 1990s. And Shea Howell, who's also on this panel tonight, and Rick and I were all part of a fellowship together with seven community organizers and 30 media people. And they thought that was balanced, because they're like, no, because it's like 10 print, and 10 radio, and 10 TV, and then 10 community activists, only 3 dropped out. That's balanced. We think we actually met in this room.
Yes.
So it's a powerful reunion tonight. I'm super happy that you're on the panel. Rick is the former president and also the former executive director of the North American Indian Association on the west side of Detroit, which is the nation's longest urban Indian association, or native, or indigenous association in the country. He's Mohawk and Purepecha, and he's just got a lot to share, so I'm just going to turn it over in a bit.
I need a single hello. I'm not sure this is going to work, so I may have to talk loud. I prefer to stand, because sometimes thinking on my feet works best. My name is Shagoyeda Genhas in Mohawk. It means he who helps all those to the end of their needs. And it's amazing when we're given those names when we're young that we actually grow into them somehow. So in saying that, in Mohawk, I also need to apologize because I'm in Three Fires territory. I'm a Six Nations person. So it's like if I was to come to your home, I wouldn't rearrange your furniture for my visit. So I have to be respectful of where I am and who I'm around. So with that, if I say anything that offends you, I will apologize to you now, because I'm a pitiful human being. I'm bound to make a mistake here and there. So we always acknowledge our weaknesses before we start. So as Eliza said, I was a former board president. I grew up in NAIA. I guess I'll start with intergenerational trauma, because my family comes from Kahnawake Mohawk territory, which is near Montreal in Quebec, Canada. And this is the part where it may be offensive to some, but the church, the Catholic Church, thought that my great-grandparents couldn't handle their 9 children, so they took 4 of them and placed them in the Mount Pleasant boarding school. Mount Pleasant being here in Michigan, up north, near the Isabella Reservation. The intergenerational trauma is that my grandmother, my Aunt Eva, my Uncle Jimmy, and my Uncle Irving, great uncle and aunts, well, didn't have their mom to nurture them. Their culture was beaten out of them. Their language was forbidden to speak. So that part was very significant. When I was 5 years old, we became aware of the Detroit Indian Club, which was actually founded in 1940. So the roots of the North American Indian Association go all that way back. In 1972, they actually decided that they could provide services, and they became incorporated as the North American Indian Association of Detroit as a 501c3 nonprofit, and started out with a manpower grant from the Department of Labor, and started providing training for jobs, because people who come from the reserves don't have the skill sets or temperament to actually deal with this culture and pace out here in an urban environment. So, and eventually that evolved into a health office, which in 1993 turned into American Indian Health and Family Services, its own entity. The need for that service outgrew the room that it was in the North American Indian Association. But when I was 4 years old, or 5 years old, when we became aware of the Detroit Indian Club, I remember very significantly that we encountered people from our reservation at the NAIA, or the Detroit Indian Club at that time. The significance is that we didn't stay the whole night. It was a gathering that was supposed to be from like 7 to 9, something like what we're doing today. But we left early because my grandmother became emotional. These women were talking to her. And we went back to her house, which was on Cherry Street, just north of Plum Street. Some of you older folks may remember Plum Street as being anti-cultural center of the city of Detroit, but counterculture is probably the right word. But that's where we were at, 3rd and Cherry Street, and we went back to her house, and we were sitting there, and she started telling us stories of her past. She started to remember her language. She started to speak it. Words that I know to this day because they're the broken parts of her heritage that she could remember. And I will never forget sitting there engrossed in her stories of her aunts, her uncles, her relatives. And to think that as a young girl, to be taken from your family, your community, your country, to be placed over here to become somebody else, that's huge. She couldn't even raise her children in a cultural way. She couldn't pass down those things to her kids. She became a Catholic person. She taught her children to be Catholic. But there was an awakening in the family at that time because we became aware of a spirituality that was way deeper. And for me, it spoke volumes. So my hair is down right now because I started this room. When you walked in, you probably smelled sage or sweetgrass and some cedar out there. Well, I did a little smudging of this room to clear this space so we could hopefully have an open mind and open heart to hear these things that we're going to hear. Some of them make your heart heavy, like what Eliza brought to us in her talk. A lot of it we have to try to resolve. So some of that heaviness we may need to put to use because it's going to ground us. That heaviness puts us to the earth where we can do our most good. So, so in the history of the city of Detroit, let's just expand our knowledge a little bit. I'm going to put this down. I really don't need it. In this area, there were Ojibwe people, Potawatomi people. There are two of the three fire groups, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Odawa. Thank you. I was going to say Ottawa, which is the American way to say it. Anyways, long story short, there are still communities of those three fires people that are becoming recognized. They have historical recognition with the state. They're becoming federally recognized. They're actually getting their land back through a trust process that the government imposed that said that if you can have land and you can hold it for 25 years, it's yours. Well, in Dowagiac, Michigan, where there's a group of Potawatomi people, they started by buying a neighborhood. They bought homes in a neighborhood and provided housing initially, built a casino, and they're buying more and more of the city to actually expand their land base, which was theirs to begin with, but they're now paying for it. So there's 14 federally recognized tribes. 2 of them are gaining all their recognition back. That's Gun Lake and Dowagiac. Being 6 nations, you'll have to bear with me a little bit because it's not my history. I'm telling you somebody else's history and trying to be respectful about that. So what's interesting is that the North American Indian Association, and I do tend to go on tangents, but I will get back to what I was talking about. The NAIA, in its history, whenever it became a problem that they couldn't figure out what to resolve, is typical in Native communities where you actually get a member of your enemy. Historically, 6 nations and 3 fires folks didn't get along. So what you would do to resolve a situation is you get one member of your enemy. You send an envoy to get a member to resolve that issue. Where 6 nations folks have it maybe a little bit easier within the governance system that they had was we had clan mothers. So if you had a situation, you took it to the clan mothers and they in turn talked about it, and if they couldn't resolve it, it went to a council and on to the chief. And that system of governance was actually a pattern that Ben Franklin said, you know what, we need something like that here. And the Constitution is based on the Iroquois Confederacy and the way they resolve their situations. But between tribes, that method happened often. So in some of the conflicts we brought to the table tonight, that may be a way, not necessarily that we're enemies, but maybe one of you can help our friend here. So it's just a method of opening your heart and mind to something new that you haven't encountered before. Within the history of NAIA, people came here back in the 20s and 30s for the same reasons everybody did. The Industrial Revolution, there were jobs here. You have a big community of boxcar, they called them boxcar pueblos, but there was a contingency of people from the Southwest that came here for automotive jobs. They're iron workers. And they built this city. My grandfather built Briggs Stadium, which is now gone, and Ford Motor Company. He went to work for a company called Vandermark, which painted all the Army ambulances and UPS trucks and painted my first car. But anyways, the racism that exists here for Native people, the first time I ever encountered it was when there was a big powwow that was going on at the state fairgrounds, and we were in the Coliseum, and they actually had horses, and it was a first time that I've ever seen that in this area at a powwow situation. And we helped my mom make jewelry. And there was a woman who came to the booth, looked at all the things we made, and asked the woman, "So you're an Indian?" And my mom looked at her and smiled and said, "Yes, I am." And she said, "Wow, I thought we killed all of you off." And 5 minutes later, we had packed up, and we were driving home, and I was sitting in the front seat, and I'm looking at my mom, and she was crying. And I'd never seen that happen before. And it's powerful when you do. Because, well, I'm the first in my family, the oldest child. And you always look out for your mom. That's your job. So, I know that I've gone a lot around issues and things, but I am happy to answer questions when we break out into the groups. I know I'm running out of time, but I thank you for your attention. It's an honor to be here and share at least this little bit of stories with you. Stories are how we shared knowledge. It's this time of year that when you couldn't be out dancing on a powwow ground, that you would come inside and you would sit around the fire and you would tell your stories so that everybody knew your history. So here we are. Jamon, any questions?
Thank you. Our next speaker is Jamon Jordan, who is an educator and a historian, and he's also the founder of the Black Scroll Network, in which he provides tours, Black History tours, History of Detroit, various components, dimensions of the city's history. How many in the room have taken a tour with Jamon? Hopefully you all will very soon. Right now, he'll give us a tour of sorts by presenting for us tonight. So please welcome Jamon.
I like to get permission from my elders to speak. In African culture, we request permission from our elders before we speak. So if you 50 or above, permission granted. Somebody.
That's the elder part.
That might be the ancestor. All right, so we'll wait on that. But what I wanted to say was to really come after my brother who just got up. And so I'm building on the foundation that's already been set for me, is that when we're talking about the development of the city of Detroit, and we're talking about these visions of the city of Detroit, understand that we're not starting at a blank space. We're starting that with some stuff that's already happened. Yes. So we're not starting from scratch, or we'd be having a different conversation. Some stuff has happened. And much of the development of the city of Detroit, and much of what's clouding, or maybe illuminating our vision about what the city of Detroit really is or should be, is really overlaid with the idea of white supremacy, and then on top of that, this idea of corporate capitalism. Yes. All right, so these are two ideas that have really infused the way we think and what we, maybe either what we think is good or what we think we ought to be struggling against. Yes. So depending on what side of that equation you fall on, it is, of course, having something to do with how you think about the city. You are not away from that. You are not protected from how you view the city from those ideas. Because Detroit's very development is built on that foundation. So my brother's already talked about the fact that the Anishinaabe people, the Council of Three Fires, they had to encounter white supremacy. They had to encounter the French first, when Antoine de la Motte the Cadillac arrives on July 24, 1701, and builds a fort for Pontchartrain du Detroit on the site of what is now Cobo Hall. And so he builds that fort, and it goes about 4 blocks north, what we call 4 blocks today, to a street that we now call 4th Street. That's why it's called 4th Street, because it's the limits of the fort. And he's not there because he's trying to discover Detroit. But if you go to the Detroit Historical Museum, they have him there as the founder of the city of Detroit. But there were already people here. So he's not the founder of the city of Detroit, he's the Columbus of the city of Detroit. But he's not even coming to try to discover a new land. That's not even his purpose. If you read his stuff, he won't say that. He's coming because people are already here, and he wants to facilitate a lucrative fur trade with them. So he's trying to make money. So this is the first development idea from outsiders who come into the city of Detroit. And every development idea that's been ballyhooed by all mainstream media since has always come from outsiders in the city of Detroit. So we're going to talk about a little bit of that. I can't do this presentation, but I'm going to go through some of the slides of this presentation, not the whole thing. So we're going to go through. So when we talk about Detroit's problems and the downfall, these are the usual suspects. So you won't get in a conversation about what's wrong with the city of Detroit without those three coming up. So of course there's Kwame Kilpatrick, former Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick, the Honorable Mayor Coleman Alexander Young, in the 1967 rebellion. Those three are the number 1, 2, and 3 named reasons for all the problems in the city of Detroit right now. And of course these three never come up, or rarely. Let me not say they'll never come up. They rarely come up. They don't come up as much as the other three. And these are the saviors of the city of Detroit. So generally, they're spoken of in a way that they're making, I'm not saying anything's right or wrong yet. I'm just presenting the way things have been presented generally, all right? And so you see, those are the presenters, they generally present the saviors, and their ideas and visions for what Detroit ought to be and will become are generally the ones that are applauded and jumped on by, jumped on in a positive way by mainstream sources. So, oops, I'm hitting the wrong button, okay. But of course, we have to lay that on the side of what's actually happening with a significant number of people in the city of Detroit, that we have thousands of water shutoffs that have been going on for a long time, but even intensified in the last 5 years. And it's hard for me to do this the way I really want to do it, because Sawatu was my student 12 years ago. So she was in my 8th grade class. So thinking about trying to do this and thinking about what's going on with her is a challenge for me right now. And so, of course, nothing that's happened in the city of Detroit has just gone without people resisting. And of course, the dark colors you see are the property foreclosure in the city of Detroit that are either happened or they are eligible for property foreclosures. And so, as you can see, the city of Detroit is real, real dark, and we're not just talking about the people. So I'm going to go through all this. Okay, so of course, one of the major booms in development of the city of Detroit comes on the backs of Henry Ford, $5 a day, building the Model T. You probably heard that story. So, of course, what's not talked about is that Henry Ford is one of the foundations. Let's go back to the French period. The French are the foundation of white supremacy in the city of Detroit. So let's start there. So when the French arrived, they set up a system of white supremacy. When the French arrived to have their fur trade with the indigenous people, they're knee deep in another trade known as the slave trade. And they bring slavery to the city of Detroit. So if you didn't know, Detroit had slavery. And so much of the wealthy French, they're enslaving indigenous people, and they're bringing Africans who are enslaved to the city of Detroit as well. And so we know their names. They become ensconced as part of Detroit's landscape. We know Antoine Beaubien, but we don't just say it, we just say Beaubien for short. We know Jean Rivard, but we just say Rivard for short. We know Louis de Quinder, but we just say de Quinder. We know Francois Livoinois, or we just say Livernois. These are slave owners in the city of Detroit. Yes, sir. All right? And so when the British defeat the French and take this land after the 7 Years' War, which the British named the French and Indian War, they won, and when you win, you get to name the war. And so they named it after two groups of people that were their major enemies, the French and the indigenous people. And so the British take over, and they also are practicing slavery in the city of Detroit. In fact, William McComb is the largest slave owner in Michigan's history. And he's a British. And the French, once they are not in control, they move to take government positions under the British control. So they're French residents who are wealthy, And since the British, they are in control, but they haven't moved a lot of British people here yet, the French take control of the government positions, the mayors and the different positions we call them today. And so they're really ensconcing themselves, they're putting themselves and their white supremacist ideas as part of the framework of the city of Detroit. When the British lose this land to the United States after the Revolutionary War, the American Revolution, the British will do the same thing. They will take on the first mayor positions, the first people in charge of the common schools. Before they were public schools, they were called common schools. But these are the slave owners. These are the people who dispossessed the indigenous people. And they're bringing those ideas and making them part of the government. All right? So they're infusing the government with white supremacist ideas at the very framework of what we now call the city of Detroit. So Detroit has never been, since the French arrived, has never been away from this idea of developing based on white supremacy. All right? And so as different groups of African people and African American people come in contact, and indigenous people come in contact with the French and British, and then later the Americans, they're coming in contact with this already set up system of white supremacy. And so you get the first major push, well, you got already a push at the beginning, but then you get another later push in the 1860s. So of course it's Civil War. It's a civil war going on in America. Down south, of course, we know why they seceded. The secession is largely on the issue of slavery. But the North ain't practicing equality. All right? So in the middle of the Civil War, Detroit is going to have a race riot. And this race riot is really pushed, almost created out of whole cloth by the longest still existing institution in the city of Detroit. And that institution at that time was known as the Michigan Intelligentsia and Democratic Free Press. But you know it today simply as the Detroit Free Press. So the Detroit Free Press was a Democratic paper. It sided with the South during the Civil War. It was anti-Lincoln, it was anti-emancipation, it was anti-black. And basically what they threatened African Americans, black people in the city of Detroit was they told whites, these black people are going to come to the city of Detroit, they're going to live next to you white people, y'all going to let that happen? They're going to take your jobs, you're going to let that happen? They're going to molest your women, y'all going to let that happen? What you going to do about it? And out of that, along with an arrest of an African American saloon owner who was alleged to have molested a young white girl, out of that, the Free Press is going to create this race riot in the city of Detroit. On the backs of that race riot, just so you know, the girls recanted. 5 years later. Yeah, 5 years later they recanted and said it never happened. They were paid to tell that story. But what happens though is on the backs of that, Detroit is going to create a segregated school system. So prior to that, black people couldn't go to school at all. When Detroit public schools are founded in 1842, black people are not allowed to go. So even the foundation of the school system, which was founded by the same people who were the slave owners and the people who were dispossessed the indigenous people. Those are the same people who founded the school system. They're the same people who founded this university whose shirt I'm wearing. So, and the first high school, of course, was all male. Girls couldn't even go. So this is the foundation of the city of Detroit. So when we get to 1863, you have African Americans who are segregated in the school system. They have to go. The name of the school for black people is colored school. So we're real clear on what kind of system this was. And so now you're getting this push. Now at one point, African Americans in the city of Detroit were living everywhere in the city of Detroit. Why were they living everywhere? Because they were enslaved. And everywhere slave owners lived, black people lived. They didn't live on the Lower East Side, just Black Bottom. They lived in Grosse Ile, they lived on Belle Isle, they lived up where we now, Cash Street. Right there, Cash Street, that was McComb's farm. So the street Cass was McComb's farm, ran from the river all the way to what is now Wayne State's campus. So black people lived everywhere, but after 1863, now they're going to begin housing segregation and school segregation and other forms of cordoning African Americans into one area. This is going to intensify when more black people come in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, through the 40s, doing what is called the Great Migration. And Henry Ford will be the next standard bearer of this, because even though he's paying $5 a day and this equal wage, he is creating a system of segregation and is giving a foundation to housing segregation, to keep African Americans living in different neighborhoods. And he'll do it even on the city level with Inkster and Dearborn, where he'll develop Inkster for his black workers and help to develop Dearborn for his white workers and enforce this segregation, even in the homes of his workers. All right? So I'm going to go to the end. Just so you know, when we talk about cities, when you vision cities, of course, the first thing you got to vision is people. That's the most important resource and the most important asset that all cities have are the people. But second is housing. And the development of Detroit is really based on housing. And housing was restricted for African Americans. In fact, the whole system of restrictive housing was created. Large portions of this idea of racial restrictive housing that goes throughout the country, large portions of that was developed first in the city of Detroit and Chicago. Those two places really kind of set the standard for where racial restrictive housing comes from. And the federal government is going to jump on that. And the federal government is going to make policies that will forever create a system of inequality. Because the federal government in 1934 with the first National Housing Act, and then it's going to back that up with the National Housing Act of 1937, the one in 1949 is going to help to fund the building of all white communities and take resources out of African American communities. And so the communities will stay divided from that point on. The income gap between African Americans and whites is only 40%. It's 40%. That's bad. African Americans make about 40% of what whites have, of what the average white family has. That's bad. But the wealth gap between African Americans and whites, African Americans have on average 5% of the wealth of whites. Now you can trace that all the way back to slavery, but you don't have to. You can go back just 70 years to those National Housing Acts, and you'll see that much of the wealth gap was created when the federal government was basically giving free money to one group of people so that they could have housing, and blocking another group of people from ever having access to that income. So we have two systems that was created. It's artificial. It's created by policies. Once the federal government did that, state and local governments created zoning laws for areas that do not receive that subsidy from the federal government. So if you didn't get federal funding to build your housing development, in other words, it wasn't an all-white housing development, then a liquor store could be built on your neighborhood. Or a plant, or a
Marathon oil.
A marathon oil.
A weed shop.
A weed shop. So this is built in. So we're not coming at this as if it's an all brand new thing. So I'm going to move to the end. So of course, African Americans says, hey, they couldn't avail themselves of federal government help. They created their own communities. So Black Bottom, which originally wasn't named because of the black people, but eventually by the 1930s, that's what people were talking about. They had forgotten what the French were talking about that soil. By the 1930s, people was calling it Black Bottom, and they had forgotten about the soil. So African Americans created their own business district, which we know is Paradise Valley. And of course, the federal government will come up with a highway policy. And Cobo will jump on that and build I-75 and I-375 right through Hastings Street, right through the African American business district.
Shortest highway, shortest federal highway.
And much of what we call development in the city of Detroit downtown right now, the Illich development, and I'm not hating on none of this right now. The Dan Gilbert developments, and much of the developments that are going on downtown, that development, this great development that we've seen in the city of Detroit, had it not been for the destruction of Paradise Valley, this would be African American expansion of Paradise Valley. Come on, man. So this would be a totally different downtown than what we're seeing. Not that it wouldn't be as great, but that it would be all of these small, what at one point were small African American businesses instead of one man owning 90 buildings in a small area. This would be a group of different African American business owners owning different kinds of businesses. And so I'm going to end it right there.
Thank you, Jamon. Next, we have Shea Howell. Shea is an activist and an educator. She's an educator in the formal sense. She's a professor of communications at Oakland University. She also is an educator in the community sense, in the multiple spaces and settings. As well as an activist. And she has been and is now a member of many organizations. Check, 1, 2. Can you hear me? It's not working, is it working?
It's working.
You hear me? Thank you. So she's a member of the James and Grace Lee Boggs Center to Nurture Community Leadership. She's a member of We the People. She's a member of the Detroit Independent Freedom Schools. And before all of those, she was a founder of an organization called Detroit Summer, which eventually evolved into Collective. And Detroit Summer, through most, if not all of its history, used this building as its home base. So Shea, there, and as you heard earlier, in another organization and several organizations, has been in this space as part of the history of struggle in the city for the last 40 years. So now she'll speak to us, drawing from that history of struggle, and help us think about how we can envision struggle today. So please welcome Shea Howell.
I don't know about this. I'll give it a try. But first, I want to thank my brothers here in the early part of today. This was important to be with both of you. And thank all of you who put this together. You know, I've been writing a lot lately and trying to not use words like war, battle, warrior, fight. But sometimes I think we just have to say, this is a war. And this is a war about the future of our city, about the future of our country. And what Dr. King said, it's about the soul of America. And, you know, I had heard about Soweto earlier, but just thinking about this, our people in this city are being removed through jail, through foreclosures, through trumped up charges, through water shutoffs, through school closings. All of that is happening every single day because some people have a vision of Detroit as whiter, wealthier, and a playground for young people, not a place to honor our elders or to honor the people who have built this city over the centuries.
That's right.
And if we want anything different, we are going to have to understand that this is not an ordinary time. Grace Boggs used to always ask us, what time is it on the clock of the world? And she would say to us that we needed to understand that today isn't yesterday. It is different. And what I think we need to see is that Detroit is helping us understand that the world is not just going to be a little worse tomorrow. It's not just going to be a little more brutal tomorrow, or a little more ugly, or with a few more people locked up in jail that we know and love. Tomorrow and the next day and the next day are part of a vicious, brutal struggle to reshape and take over this country by people who have one thing in mind, making money for themselves. We are living in a time of unbridled corporate greed, and the rest of us are going to bleed to feed that greed. And I think we have to understand that essential to this moment is the notion that democracy cannot any longer be tolerated. That is the #1 lesson from Detroit. As weak, as anemic, as limp and crazy and all of those things that the democracy we had was, it was too much for the corporate powers to bear. So now what you see is the morphing of capitalism into something that is racialized financial capital that is determined to destroy the capacity of people in public spaces to decide the future of our own lives and our own city. Instead, it is creating justifications in its own logic that Brother Jamon just rolled down for us, creating justifications in its own logic that say all decisions should be made by technocrats, all decisions should be made by people who weigh the bottom line against human values. And that effort to remove any democratic decision-making is what's been happening in Michigan in general, in Detroit in particular, and especially in cities where there are people of color in the majority. We know that's where the emergency managers went. So just consider for a moment what this assault has looked like in Detroit. Michigan, 55% of African Americans lost the right to vote for local government. 75% of African American elected officials were removed from government. 100,000 people in Flint under emergency management were poisoned, and more than 100,000 people in Detroit had their water shut off. If we start looking at what has happened in our downtown, one white man owns 100 buildings. Most of those buildings were transferred into his hands without any public comment at all. One billionaire family took almost $300 million from the school funds.
That's right. That's right.
And used them to build a stadium for hockey players. Or if you look at the school system, we've closed over 100 schools in 10 years. And the schools that are open are not fit for our children to be in. And that is the present moment that we are living in. Now, what we also need to know is that Detroit has resisted this kind of inhumanity from the very beginning.
That's right.
All you need to do is go over to Elmwood Cemetery, where you can see Bloody Run Creek.
That's right.
The only place left where the land has not been shaped by industrial drive.
That's right.
But the reason why you should go there is because that's where Chief Pontiac created the largest first anti-imperial army to defeat the British in the world. It was a massive military victory of resistance, not just against European outsiders, but against a way of life that threatened this space. That spirit of resistance flows through this city everywhere. It is that spirit of resistance that has created, I think, the alternative vision for Detroit. It is resistance that begins with honoring place, honoring people, and drawing on values that don't emphasize economics, that don't emphasize private wealth, and that do emphasize our capacity to create together the things we need by the people who use them. Detroit has had the virtue of being abandoned by industrial capital first. So we had 20 years to develop new ways of living, to ask, what do people do when the big industries go? And our answer for that was, we turn to each other and start taking care of each other and this land.
Right.
And that's why elder women from the South began to look at all of this open land and say, we can raise food there for ourselves and our community. Today, almost 30, 40 years later, we now have the largest urban gardening movement in the world. The largest urban gardening movement in the world. And we can produce 3/4 of the fruits and vegetables to feed this city. Or as Gerald Hairston used to say, a city that feeds itself, frees itself. The second thing that you can see as you go around the city is all kinds of cooperative efforts at new work. Whether it's people who are coming together to make tea or bake bread or provide new plates for us to carry so when we go to our potlucks we have something other than paper. People are thinking about what do we need and how do we produce that together in ways that share the resources that will make life better. The third thing that you'll see is that people are all across the city recreating neighborhood ties. Some people are opening their garages so kids can make pots. Other people are doing murals on walls. Other people are using their basements for sound recordings and studios. Some people are doing literacy, and around the city are these little wonderful libraries where people are coming together to read. Here, every Monday night, we have the Detroit Independent Freedom Schools. Across the city, even though our schools are failing, communities are coming together to educate anyway. We are teaching our children to care for themselves, to care for each other, and also to care about their capacity to create a different kind of city. Because what we see happening is that the whiter, wealthier vision for this city is being given voice every day in the dominant media.
That's right.
Every day we hear some version of Detroiters are too incapable, too corrupt, too Kwame, or too whatever to be able to run our own affairs.
That's right.
We have to be saved from ourselves by some white suburbanite, like Brooks Patterson, whose famous line was, we should put a fence around Detroit, herd all the Indians in, and throw over the blankets and corn. He didn't say that in 1970s when he was protecting NAG. He said that to the New Yorker in 2014
That's right.
as part of the bankruptcy.
That's right.
So we need to understand that the idea that we can make decisions for ourselves about our future is what scares the white power structure. And that's why it is important we find new democratic forms for making decisions collectively and together. So I hope that's one of the things we will talk about today. How do we begin to create a different kind of democratic decision-making that draws on this long history of resistance, and more importantly, that draws on the values that have come from the African American tradition, the indigenous tradition, the best traditions that our people have. The best traditions that our people have. To begin to create different ways of living together. One of the things that I am proudest of when I take people on tours of Detroit to see urban gardens is, except for ones here in Cass and a couple now and again, you're not going to find a fence around any urban garden. Instead, you are going to see that that is open to anybody who needs anything. Most people who I know who garden in this city don't do it because they think they're going to get rich. They do it because they believe their actions matter. That what they do will make a difference in the fabric of their communities and in the qualities of their own lives. That belief
Bluetooth.
at a time like this, when there are so many evil forces around us, we need to understand that in times like that, the smallest actions can change the direction of the country. So each of you need to find what are those actions you can take, whether it's going down to the trial, whether it's sending some money, whether it's raising a garden, but each of us are responsible for the future now. It is no longer enough to say the bad guys are out there doing bad things, because they are going to do worse things. They are only starting on the road of taking this city. If we want to stop them, we, each of us, need to find that life-affirming, loving vision of what we want and start taking the steps forward. Thank you.
Can we just give another big round of applause? We're improvising tonight, and we got to listen to each other carefully because we're not going to be passing mics around, all right? And we're going to stay in a big group. There'll be other times we're going to break out and have discussion, but with the timing and stuff, we're going to keep ourselves in a big group. I would welcome people who just have a comment, right? And Stephen can help me kind of work the crowd and do our Phil Donahue and our Oprah Winfrey here. But also if you have particular questions, right? I ask sort of short questions, concise questions that invite short, concise answers so we can get interaction between you and the panelists. So,
And we do have a mic that's working, but
Who knows?
short, yeah, for now, working for now, and the cord is real short, sorry, Lionel. So, please stand where you are, or if you're closer, want to come to the mic. So,
comments, questions, reflections people have. Yes. I would just stand up and share this. We have the projection here.
So I heard Mama Lila last week talking about how we can't just read, we have to start taking action. And I hear all of you speaking about stories that are different stories than we hear in typical media. And so I'm wondering what suggestions you have for finding those stories in places not just on Tuesday nights, but also other actions that we can take to start taking steps to understand that story for ourselves.
Subscribe to Riverwise. Riverwise is a new magazine that is talking about the positive visions emerging in Detroit. So it comes out 4 times a year, although so far we've done 8 in 1 year. So we're a little curious in the math, but you can look at Riverwise and you can take a look at the website. There are a number of new data sources and information sources that you need to become familiar with, but definitely take a look at Riverwise. I think, though, more importantly, you need to come into the city, see what's going on, talk with people, become part of creating the future.
I'm a proponent of the fact that you have to be, if you're really serious about not just knowing about the issues that are going on in the city of Detroit, which you need to know that, but the other part is doing something about those issues that are in the city of Detroit, is that you have to become a part of an organization. So my teacher was Kwame Ture. And Kwame Ture, you may know him also as Stokely Carmichael, told us that you have to be, he told me, Jamon, you have to be a part of an organization. If you're doing anything by yourself, you're not doing anything. You have to be a part of an organization. So you have to be a part of an organization that's doing something on behalf of your people. And so I believe that that's what you have to do. You have to be a part of an organization. Because even if you are a part of an organization, the organization is going the wrong way. As an organization, the self-correction of an organization is much better than the self-correction of an ego-minded individual. Amen. So, you need to join the organization to make the efforts that you would like to see much more palatable and doable. All right, so I'm a proponent of you have to join some organization. Now, that's up to you to figure out that organization. And if you can't find an organization that you think is doing something on behalf of the people, then you need to begin or start an organization.
Well, I can tell you about the Native community that is pretty much kind of invisible around here, that in Wayne County alone, there are 20,000 roughly Native people in this county. It's the largest concentration of Native people in the state of Michigan. There are about 110 tribes represented here. If you go to American Indian Health and Family Services over near Dearborn on Lawndale, they have quite a few programs that are available and open to people to come and share. That's one place you can start, at least with our community. So, we're always trying to share that culture, trying to let you know that we're still here. We're still relevant, at least we're trying to be. But that's one place you could start.
Other thoughts, comments, questions?
I just want to also just answer that question. Another place to get both information and more information about organizations would be our new website that Aisha Jamali designed for us. So you can just go to detroitequity.org. There are currently 75. That's Aisha Jamali right there. You can clap for her. It's an amazing website. It's divided currently into, our three main areas are knowledge, network, and narrative. So knowledge, you will find resources to learn more about the issues. Network, you'll find 75 organizations and people that we partner with. So you can find some of those places to intern or volunteer, become a part of, build deep relationships with people, and work at the same time. Offer your energy. And then the narrative is like the news section. So our members are in the news and creating their own news and media all the time. And so she keeps that updated with news stories about all kinds of different organizations and people and issues. And then we also are increasing there's events, you'll find our events on there, so then there's all these other opportunities. We sometimes have multiple, we have 2 events tonight, so we have multiple events in a day. We also actions, so we'll increasingly be having calls to action that our members are, the ways that our members are taking action, so that, that's something that, an invitation for you as well. DetroitEquity.org.
Could I just add to that? One thing that's key, and Liza mentioned the word relationships. So that don't go for the book to the organization without thinking about what are your relationships. Because relationships can take you into an organization and you will have the right relationship with people. People relationships they are so important. So when I told my story, it was about relationships. And you will not learn more than if you have a relationship with a real person. It makes a difference.
Yeah, so building on the idea about relations and also about cooperative capitalism, or I call it the new liberal policy paradigm, actually is something that I believe is changing my University of Michigan as well. And I think that's a crucial and important thing, because I come from China, this is my 6 months and first time in Detroit, and I can find something very interesting is that actually in the North American research community, people are no longer public intellectuals. What I mean that is, you can see a kind of tendency that specialists are producing knowledge only for their specialists. And that's something I find is a very devastating thing, not only in Detroit, but also back to my hometown. Because you're using numbers like to trying to increase your authority. But the problem is that a lot of people don't understand your jargons and your and that's something actually is blocking a lot of people to understand politics and the economics.
Wow.
And that's where I think the North American basic research community got into a problem.
Wow.
And that's where I believe to help the democracy to exist, we should do something not only about taking actions about growing foods, and also rebuild our community by taking social actions, but also to facilitate the democratization of knowledge.
Right.
And that's something that I think the schools, the public schools, and also our public university should be committed to.
Wow.
Yes.
One point of activism is being active on your own campus.
That's right.
There's an invitation here for a line of critique and inquiry that can go to Wayne State, as well as University of Michigan, as well as University of Dearborn. Any quick reflections or thoughts about knowledge and production of knowledge and higher education?
Peter and I were just having this conversation in the, coming over here. One of the great things happening in the, one of the great things happening in the city is because of the failure of the public institutions, people are creating new forms of knowledge out of answering their own questions. So one of the things you see, for example, is during the water struggle, we created this wonderful map of the water shutoffs to be able to see where they are happening. Or the wonderful picture of the foreclosures. That didn't just pop up out of nowhere.
That's right.
These are people who are not usually not sanctioned by the university, but creating new knowledge. So universities are being left behind right now because they are asking small questions in big times.
Other questions in the back here? And I'll be looking up here so I'm not neglecting anyone.
On a practical level, like one thing you can do to expand connections and network is just make a point every week to talk to one or two people you don't know about issues. Not even necessarily activism, but just stuff you like, dislike, expand your social networks, and then have those networks talk to other networks. And then over time, the result is larger and larger groups of interconnected people toward common cause, able to affect change.
Great. I'm just going to let people popcorn out so we can sort of get a number of different voices, and you in the back, please. Anybody else that's got to indicate to me as I gaze around?
I just wanted to make a comment, basically, just basically a comment. I'll be 50 this year.
Go ahead.
And I started when I was 12 into activism because one, because my mother forced me to, and I had no other choice. That was the rule. You had to be a part of something. And I still do that to this day. I drug my son here, he's so well. Yeah, he raised his hand. But I say that to say, I'm looking at all these young faces in here, and it's a heartwarmer for me because the powers that be are looking for you all not to do the work. They're finding new ways for you not to get along with your brother and your sister. They're using economic status to create narratives to separate us. So with that being said, I'm just saying, do it because it's something you don't feel like you have to do. And I don't get paid to go anywhere, none of the places I go. I do it out of love for the people and let go of the narratives that people say where certain classes or races of people are certain things. That's where my ignorance came at growing up sometimes because I had my own issues with certain races of people, and I'm black. But with that being said, that is the very thing that we need to get away from. because of the fact that we are in this room. I can sit here and feed everybody here at my house. And that's just literally being honest, if you ask my son. But at the same time, I've broken bread and I have a Native American in my family too as well. So, you know, that part when I received to say, oh my God, I wish I could I burn incense all the time, so I love that. But I'm just saying that embrace each other's culture because we're part of the human race, and that's only one race. So for me, I'm just saying, you know, I'm a part of so many organizations I can barely, it's like I have a job. But I'm saying that I have a job, but the food is great. But at the same time, I'm just what I'm saying is, don't let the narratives of what is going on in society change the way you feel about each other, about this space, about it, you know, in this room. Because trust me, I'll keep us here all night, but I'm gonna sit and take
Coming through, yes, sir.
So I'm an international student, and I've been an international student for the past 8 years living in the United States. And growing up, I encountered a different form of racial segregation. It wasn't black and white. It was, you know, different between different cultures and nationalities. And so, what are some steps that I can take that will help me translate what I'm learning in Detroit, and if I have to go back home, like translate those into other cultures, or try to solve racial segregation from a global standpoint as opposed to looking at it from black and white.
And where are you from, just to contextualize?
I'm born and brought up in Dubai.
Anybody want to take a crack at our global community?
Well, I think it's important to understand that what is happening in Detroit, where people who have been marginalized by capital are coming together to create creative solutions from the bottom up. The top-down doesn't work. And that is true whether you're in Dublin or in the mountains of Chiapas or Detroit or Puerto Rico or Haiti. This is a global phenomenon. The world is shifting. And we want to help that shift be toward love, toward life, toward the best in us. And that's happening globally, not just in Detroit. Part of the excitement of Detroit is it's happening globally and in Detroit.
You, very, very refreshing. It's very rejuvenating to hear each of you, so thank you so very much. Racism is so pervasive at every stage of our experience. It's easier for me as a Detroit African American to get a $400,000 home loan than it is to get a $40,000 small business loan. And you spoke to that, Shea. We marginalize. If I say terrorism, for example, who do we think of?
That's right.
If I say immigration, who do we think of? Yeah. If I say criminals, who do we think of? But the reality is, none of that's true. So we tend to racialize and we marginalize. We'll say Arabs, this is their issue. All of us should care about immigration. All of us should care about terrorism. All of us should care about criminals. So I'm saying several things, but I care especially deeply about voting. Young people aren't voting. I don't care what they say. How do we bridge that divide? How do we encourage young people to know that these are the sleeping giants? These are the folk that can make the difference. And my generation voted in record numbers, and we still do. And when we look at the numbers, most people running for public office don't spend a lot of time with young people because it's not the best use of their time or resources. So how do we bridge that divide? And am I wrong?
Right. Another quick comment.
I want to respond to that by saying I think part of the way to bridge that divide is to encourage the development of greater social capital in these youth, whether it's through their education in the public school system or through after-school programs that are provided for them and funded
for them that give them leadership opportunities that are not just performative, but they can gain actual skills from. Whether it's the little things like how to write grants or how to go about the process of getting a nonprofit incorporated, you know, or going about through arts programs or music or literary or theater, etc., LGBT, leadership, all of it. To have that space, I'm speaking as someone who was afforded a lot of that space in Ann Arbor Public Schools growing up and as a part of Neutral Zone Youth Center in Ann Arbor growing up. So that afforded me an opportunity, even though I came from a close to poverty background, to develop some skills that had me in a different strata than what I would have traditionally belonged to growing up, you know? That kind of taught me, hey, if you do leadership, there's a way that you can actually affect change and have it be legitimate. You know, you can't just handhold youth throughout that process. You have to actually let them lead.
Very good.